I'm Dr. Challa Krishnaveer Abhishek. I'm soft skills trainer of Andhra University. I'm director of Center for Emotional Education. So today's lecture is on e-literature, that is electronic literature. So, so basically, electronic literature is also called digital literature or new media literature, and also we can call it social media literature. So because it's a literature that is produced on the computers and it is consumed on the computers again, produced and consumed on the computers. So that is e-literature. So basically, we use games, we use puzzles. There's a lot of playing, and then the story goes forward. For example, this a cartoon series called Dora, wherein the Dora asks us few questions before going forward, and once we answer the question, and the Dora takes it forward according to our answer. So it's like that. Electronic literature is very interactive and it's multimedia oriented and it's completely electronic. It's produced on the computers and also it's consumed on the computers. So it's not like our regular books where our regular books are basically they're though they're written on the computers, they're published on paper and they're consumed as a book. We can also consume a book as a PDF or as a Word file, but that doesn't count as e-literature. So I guess the slides are open, right? Yeah. So what is literature? I guess literature, you know what literature is because you're literature students. Literature, a body of written works. The name has traditionally been applied to those imaginative works of poetry and prose distinguished by the intentions of their authors and the perceived aesthetic excellence of their execution. So basically, literature encompasses aesthetics, and the intentions of the author. It has a plot, and the words are beautifully explained, or the words are beautifully used in a way to create pleasure. So that is basically literature. You have different forms of literature. You have poetry, you have prose, you have drama. But in literature, our main focus will be on prose and poetry. Yeah, next slide, please. So electronic literature. Electronic literature is a literature, as I've already told you, which is born digitally. So it has to be born digitally and has to be consumed digitally also. So a literary work designed on a computer meant to be read on a computer. So what is the meaning of being read on a computer? The meaning is it's actually like a movie where you are completely consuming the literature on the computer. So because basically there are books of different sizes, different shapes, and similarly e-literature actually it encompasses, it's like a book of different size, different shape, different font, interactive font actually, hypertext, etc. So it is an amalgamation of all that. So digital born, first generation digital object created on a computer meant to be read on a computer. So that is digital literature. So digital literature actually it was born during 1950s, and now digital literature is actually playing a major role. In my previous lectures actually I focused on MOOCs, massive open online courses, and I believe that massive open online courses are also e-literature. Because we are consuming them completely. It depends again if it is an interactive fiction or if it is a poetry. If it is a literary piece, I also believe that MOOCs can serve as e-literature. So that's the advantage is what I believe, and it incorporates e-literature incorporates multimedia where you can use photos, you can use hyperlinks, you can use music, you can use animation, you can use hypertext, etc. So e-literature, unlike books, it's basically dynamic. It's very dynamic. You can add to it, multiple users can add multiple stories to it, multiple plots to it, multiple words to it, and actually e-literature talks to you, you can communicate, you can interact with it. So it is very dynamic and it's not static, and whenever you start reading e-literature, it always changes itself, it always changes its plots, it always changes its the dimensions of it. So the dimensions, everything keeps on changing. So e-literature is dynamic. So what makes, which also can be called as digital literature, is basically, as I've told you, we are adding photos, we are adding music, we are adding videos, we are adding hypertext, we are adding interactive words, where the words are moving here, we are adding animations, we are adding multimedia, we make it more
pleasurable. The experience of consuming e-literature is very pleasurable in comparison to the book. But similarly, book has its own advantages, feeling the book. You can actually touch the book, you can actually smell the book. These two aspects are missing in e-literature, because whenever we get a book from Amazon or Flipkart or some other site, whenever we open the box, the first thing we do is to smell the book, touch the book, feel the book. So that aspect of literature, consuming literature, is missing in e-literature. But at the same time, e-literature is more dynamic, and I believe that e-literature is more interesting because nowadays we're all engrossed in, we're interested in, the recently PUBG is banned, but e-literature is something similar to PUBG, where you get commands, you can give commands, you can play, you can instruct, you will get instructions. So there is a lot of interaction that is being going on. So that's the advantage of e-literature. So e-literature is a work that could exist only in the space for which it is developed. For example, the e-literature is being developed, is always developed on a computer. So it can only be consumed on a computer, not as a printed form. So PDFs, as I've already told you, PDFs and docs or Amazon Kindle, they don't come under e-literature. So e-literature has to be interactive and has to be developed and consumed in the computer, and you should be able to interact with the text. So interacting with the text in Amazon, in Kindle, or for example PDF or MS Doc, I guess it's not possible. So that's the advantage of e-literature. So which can also be called digital literature is okay. Shall we move on to the next slide? I guess it's complete. We move on to the next slide. Yep. Literary in e-literature. Incorporating multimedia into digital literature does not diminish the creation of meaning in literary texts, but other factors play more influential roles in meaningful conception. So different conceptions, different conceptual ideas, different dimensions of literature are being touched in e-literature. So that's the main major advantage of it. Next slide, please. So print versus e-literature. So what's the difference between print and e-literature? So that's what we'll be looking at now. So as I've already told you, accordingly, before that, e-literature is something which is produced on a computer and consumed on a computer. So print, the example, that is a book, is maybe it might be developed on a computer, but it is published and it is consumed as a book or PDF or Kindle or doc. So that's how you consume print version of it. So e-literature is different, as I've already stressed upon. And so e-literature uses photos, hyperlinks, music, animation, hypertext, etc. E-literature is dynamic, whereas books are static. How many ever times you open the book, it is same, it doesn't change. Whereas e-literature keeps on changing. So that's the main advantage of it. So basically you have Catherine Hales. She talks about the importance of e-literature and how print literature that has been. She talks about how print literature, because now you have a lot of piles of books and it is very difficult to store all these piles of books. So a database is created. So these piles of books are created in text form, in PDF formats actually. So these formats of books, or these digitization of books, is actually not considered as e-literature. So that's that thing you have to put in mind. So carrying books is difficult. So digitizing it is also not e-literature. Digital is algorithmic. Basically, digital literature is completely based on algorithm. It is multi-mode. Language and computation is important. So basically, when I was talking about MOOCs, I discussed about something called digital humanities, where it is a combination. It's a multidisciplinary field, which is a combination of humanities and computer science. So language. So in order to create e-literature, I believe that the creator has to have a command on programming, especially HTML or C or Python. I think Python is not as difficult. Python is very simple, and I guess students from arts background can easily master it and create e-literature pieces. Yes. And it differs. E-literature is basically differs in presentation and expression.
So e-literature is basically natural language processing. So it uses machine translation, natural language processing, voice recognition, speech recognition, and all. Yeah. So quality is increasing. So basically, in e-literature, the main advantage is the quality is increasing. Quality is more. There's more quality, and and it is more interesting. It actually creates some sort of enthusiasm when you compare it with print. And the presentation is easy actually because it appeals to all your sense organs, all the five sense organs are appeased by it. So there's a pleasure given to all your sense organs, except as I've told you, your touch and the smell is component is missing. So apart from that, because the presentation is easy and because it's appealing to your main sense organs, I believe that e-literature is more interesting. Yes. So we are now talking about Electronic Literature Organization. Electronic Literature Organization is a non-profit organization. You can go through their website. Uh, Founded in 1999 by Scott Redberg, Robert Coover, and Jeff Bellow. The Electronic Literature Organization was established in Chicago in 1999. So it is a community of like-minded people who are interested in developing content, creating content, and consuming content on computers. So because at that time, especially during the 1990s and all 1980s, computer was something new, something interesting, something important. So at that time, they were thinking of why can't we consume literature digitally? That's how the idea was conceived by Scott, Robert, and Jeff. So serving as executive director. So basically, Bellow is the first president, and Redberg serving as its executive director to foster and promote reading, writing, teaching, and understanding of literature as it develops and persists in a changing, developing environment, a dynamic environment that is a virtual environment, that is our computers. Yes, next slide. So basically, to disseminate the main mission of Electronic Literature Organization is basically to promote writing, publishing, and reading of literature in electronic media, convened committee headed by Nova Wardrop, himself a creator and critic of electronic literature. So they have a mission to disseminate its processes, the process of e-literature, elements of e-literature, writings of e-literature, and how to make it more creative. Yes, next slide. Yeah, Robert Coover and Christopher Strachey. So basically, e-literature Robert Cooper brought e-literature to the public's attention with his essay "The End of Books." So in 1992, you'll find a PDF version of it actually, if you can Google it. So that is the end of books basically. So the print, he's talking about the end of print books because nowadays we're completely digitalized thanks to the pandemic. It's like a blessing in disguise. We understood the importance of virtual environment, and we are all interacting socially. We are maintaining this social interaction through virtual environment in a safe way. So in the end of books, he discussed extensively on how the print will slowly vanish and how e-literature will be taking over. So it was conceived during 1992. So a love letter generator created by Christopher Strachey. So I guess you have to remember this. So this is very important, especially for your net or set exam. So because this is the first e-literature piece, a love letter generator created by Christopher Strachey for the Manchester Mark I computer in 1952 is considered the first example of digital work. So this is the first example of digital work. Yeah, next slide, please. So technologies in e-literature. So a digital literature collection embraces a range of technologies, including ambient. So ambient is basically, it talks about the immediate surroundings, animation and kinetic. So the words are in kinetic motion. There's animation, there's multimedia, and it's procedural. It goes by a process. I guess you have heard about this book called Goosebumps, which follows a certain procedure. And if you select a particular option, the story goes into a completely different conclusion. So e-literature is procedural like that, and e-literature is generative because it's coded completely. You can generate your own haiku or your own poetry or your own fiction based on a given keywords. So, and also
Flash, it uses Flash. I guess you know what Flash is. JavaScript is also used to develop e-literature, and Shockwave. So Shockwave is basically a video games distributor. It's a portal for video games, and VRML, virtual reality modeling language, is also used in developing literature. Yes, next slide. So, Electronic Literature Organization, this is the first volume of an anthology, a collection of e-literary pieces. Actually, it was given out in 2006. You can find it in the website. That's the first volume, and the second volume is developed with even more content in during 2011 actually, and the third volume that is given out, published in the online world in 2016. It actually, you can see, the user interface is changed in comparison with the 2006 and 2011 edition. It's like, they have added the app version. So it is more user integrated. So that is the 2016 version of it. Yes, please, next slide. Evolving electronic literature. So hardware and graphical programs were developed in 1960s. A few poets started to use digital tools to create visual poems. When the technology became available, artists started to create digitally static and animated works and to manipulate language to increase visual properties. So visual aesthetics were taken into consideration. It is an important evolving field of artistic practice and literary study. Next slide. This is just, this is just a recap, I guess. So works of electronic literature appeal to configurative reading practices. It's based on a gift economy and developing a network-based literary culture. So basically, literary culture network is also being thought to, to develop a community of electronic literature, consumers and creators and producers, in order to create an awareness, a sensitization on e-literature. The process of reading any configurative or ergodic form of literature invites the reader to first explore the ludic challenges and pleasures of operating and transversing the text in a hyper-attentive and experimental fashion before reading more deeply. I guess it's understood. Next slide. So the first generation electronic literature, these are some of the examples of electronic literature. So Michael Joyce, Afternoon, a Story, 1990. Stewart's Victory Garden, 1995. Shirley Jackson's Patchwork Girl, 1995. Dina Larson's Marble Springs, 1993. These were the, one of the few first primary, actually, literary pieces on digitalized literary pieces. Yes. Next slide. So second generation literature, e-literature. So these are a few of the examples. I have given you certain links. You can click the link and you can consume the content, consume the literary piece. Next slide, please. So characteristics of e-literature. So non-linearity. So unlike book, there is not a linear procedure. The aspect keeps on changing because, as I've told you, it is dynamic. We get to choose the procedure. We get to choose the option. We get to choose the alternative. So it is not a linear thing. I guess again, I'll come back to this book called Goosebumps. I guess you have heard of it. It's e-literature is something similar to it. So interactivity. So there's a lot of interactivity. The computer talks to you and you are talking to the computer. So there's a lot of interaction. It's similar to your video games that you play. And multimedia, so multimedia aspects are included. And we also got transients, transients and 3D. 3D because I guess you've heard about this game called Temple Run, where the cave is the cave aspect of it. The cave graphic is completely 3D. So 3D gives a feeling of us being involved in the literary piece. So, and also it is a fusion with different art forms. Different art forms have added to it, so that to make it more interactive, more efficient, more effective, and more productive, and more interesting. So, creating an enthusiasm, because I believe that now PUBG is banned, but before, when PUBG was there, students used to consume it for at least 10 to 12 hours a day. So they used to spend their half of the day on PUBG. I've seen students do that. So, and PUBG is a form of e-literature because you're giving commands, you're taking commands, and there's story development happening. So like that, the first virtual game, that focused more on e-literature is basically the Harry Potter game. If you would have played it, it was constructed or conceived in 2008. So which was a very interesting game, where you need to give commands, and then based on your commands, the character goes and the story develops. So it's like that. Yeah, next slide. So basically interactivity with the story, codes of the story is selected by us. So character we take and the codes of, and so is also based on the character we take, because there are multiple characters in a literature or e-literature piece, and you need to select your character, your course of action, and also the story changes according to the actions we choose, according to the characters we choose. So we can decide other characters also, and we can add certain characters, more characters, like as and also the reader is basically in literature is an active participant. Unlike a book, you're active, you're emotionally connected with the literary piece. You are an active participant of it, and it's actually like a virtual game. E-literature is like a virtual game, and I believe that incorporating e-literature in for school students, I guess it will make language learning and consuming literature more easy. So transience, in the previous slide, it basically talks about dynamism. So because as I've told you, e-literature is ever changing and dynamic, and it is not boring at all. So the story is basically temporary, because it keeps on changing. So that the story that we consumed just now changes, when you consume the same literary piece the second time. So it is so dynamic that the story keeps on changing. So it is very interesting. It's like, you're reading a new book every time you open the literary piece. So that's the advantage. And 3D and fusion we have already discussed. So e-poetry. So poetry is basically something, it's an amalgamation of emotions, is what I believe. And text cannot convey emotions, and I believe that animations, pictures, videos, sounds, every aspect of it, every aesthetic of it is important to convey the emotions completely, is what I believe. I believe that literature, it is actually not allowing us to imagine things. Imagine, because creativity part of our brain is being affected. The right brain will be affected because we are not made to think. At the same time, it is appealing, so that literature actually catches our attention. It has a longer attention period. You can it can actually take your attention for 45 minutes to 1 hour continuously without a break. So that is the advantage. So e-poetry is basically a poetry developed in a digital space. So it is also called database poetry, because you have a database of certain words, certain phrases, certain idioms, and if, for example, if you select a particular theme, based on your theme, based on your constructs, based on your elements, based on your suggestions, a poetry is automatically generated by the computer. So that is e-poetry. So, and also code poetry, so you can also write poetry in the form of code, like a Python code or a C++, Java. You can write it in the form of a code. And I believe that, when you're teaching coding to kids, so incorporating e-poetry while teaching coding to kids, will make it more interesting. Will make them, easily understand the functions of it. So the frequency. So e-poetry, it's like we can adjust the frequency, wherein you get a new poem every 5 seconds or every 10 seconds or every 15 seconds. The authors can do that. So photo poetry. So photo poetry is basically visual poetry, and also in certain poems there are word movements. You can also add GIFs, 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 GIF. So you can add GIFs, you can add word movements. For example, in the poem, if you have a word called rain, so the word can actually seem as if, the word rain is similar to the movement of raining. So that is the advantage of e-poetry. And it is very interesting. Yeah, next slide. So generative poetry. This genre is produced by programming algorithms and drawing from corpora to create poetic lines. So basically, generative poetry, it talks about, it is basically database poetry where you have a corpus of poems, a corpus of phrases, a corpus of idioms, a corpus of vocabs, you know, a corpus of different parts of speech, nouns, prepositions, adjectives, adverbs, etc. And based on your idea, based on your requirement, based on your options, or the options that you select, the poem is generated. So that is a generative poetry. Yes, next slide. So this is an example. So here, what he did, Ali Brody, what he did was, he has taken "I like it when," a phrase called "I like it when," and he has used Twitter as a database. And whoever has, tweeted "I like it when," "I like it when," he has actually collected all those tweets into a database which starts with "I like it when," and he has seen to it that his program, so that there are no repetitions, and based on that he created a poem. So he generated a poem. So similarly, you can use some other phrase, and you can use the database of Twitter, you can use the database of Facebook, you can use the database of any other social media platform, and you can generate your own poem. So that is the advantage of this. So this is just an example. So I believe that in order to venture into literature, I believe that we have to be computer savvy. We have to be a little interested in uh, coding. Actually, programming is very important. And I believe that nowadays, we cannot escape computers. So I believe that if you can learn a little bit of Python, only Python is not difficult, and it is available in all online learning platforms like edx, like nptel and all. So you can easily learn that, and you can start your own generative poetry. Next slide. So code poetry is basically writing poetry in the form of code. You can write a sonnet, you can write a ballet, you can write little different forms of poetry. You can write haiku, etc., in the form of a code. In the next slide, you'll have an example of it. We can go to the next slide. Yeah. So this is the example of it. So this is how you can create a poem in the form of a code. You know, it's like a smiley oriented poem. You can actually add smileys also to it, and you have written it in the form of a code now. This is how you can teach coding to kids also, and it is it's an interesting aspect of e-poetry. Next slide. So visual digital poetry. So both in visual digital poet, in actually in code poetry, what happens is both humans and computers can understand, because computers can understand coding only, coding language. So there will also be no repetitions, and you can use for loops for avoiding repetitions, and number of lines decreases. And code format poetry, it's like it's not like an output. Actually the code itself is poetry, is the form of poetry. So visual digital poetry, the word does what it means. So visual digital poetry is basically where the word does what it means. For example, if it's saying drips, if the word is, if there in the poetry, if there is a word called dripping, so the word drips automatically. The word starts dripping to show its characteristic. For example, if there is a word called shake, the word automatically starts shaking to show its characteristic. So it's like that. It is visual digital poetry is like that, and you can also use animation in it. Yeah, next slide. Kinetic poetry. So kinetic poetry is basically the kinetic movements of the words, and also incorporation of little multimedia. So kinetic movements are basically where the words are moving, the phrases are moving, the sentence is moving, so that the sentence or the stanza or the word or the phrase, it does what it means. So this makes it more interesting, and it actually creates a fun environment in teaching vocab, in teaching phrases and all. And also sometimes I believe that whenever we read a poem, it is very difficult for us to understand certain words, and the context, etc., what the poet means and all. So it is very difficult to decode. So I believe that kinetic poetry is something which helps us in decoding automatically, because the phrases and words does what they mean. Yes, next slide. So multimedia poetry is, it encompasses multimedia, videos, audios,
redirects, hypertext. We talked about hypertext. So hypertext can be used, where the hyper when you click the hypertext, you can understand, what the context is, what's the meaning of a particular phrase or a word that you don't know. So as I've told you, it is non-linear because you're using hypertext and you're venturing into other websites, other links, and again coming back to it. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, interactive poetry. Kisha, can we go back to the previous slide? Yeah. Uh, I guess okay. I guess we can go to interactive poetry. So this is an example of multimedia poetry where you can click certain hypertext, like arrows or the house, or you can click the gate, you can click at the dog, you can click at the person, you can click at the coffee, you can click at the tree, you can click at different places to go to what they mean. And every aspect, every element of it, every element of the picture actually has a hypertext, where different poems are written on each aspect actually. Yes, next slide. Interactive poetry. So interactive poetry is something where you can talk to the poetry, you can interact with the poetry. So if you can just zoom it, I guess you can understand what I meant. So for example, yeah. So the beginning topic, for example, if you have, if you haiku, right? So this is in the form of haiku. One word, two word, three words, four words, five words, like that. So, for example, if you have chosen sadness, so for sadness, the next two lines, it actually will be adjectives of it, lonely and silent. And the next three words will be actually words ending with ing actually, that represent sadness. So mourning, weeping, sobbing, etc. And the next line four will have four words which talk about nouns and short phrases that are linked to the topic. And the next fifth line is actually three words which are ending again with the opposite of what you have selected, that is happiness. So laughing, smiling, and singing. And the sixth line is actually two words which talks about the adjective of the opposite of the topic you have selected. And the last one, the last word is actually the complete opposite word of what you have selected. So the programmer actually programs accordingly. And for example, if I've chosen happiness, it'll end with sadness. If I've chosen sadness, it'll end with happiness. So this is how I can create an interactive poetry. I can interact with the poem. I can talk to it. I can. It actually gives me. It actually instructs me. I can give it command. It will give me command of what to do, etc. Yeah. Next slide. So and also hypertext poetry, as we already discussed, because comprehending poetry is not very easy because of the language and because of the context. We don't know the context of the poet. So here using hypertext, you can easily understand the meaning of a word, meaning of a phrase, what the poet means, etc. So it leads to holistic understanding of the feelings of the poet, and you can actually incorporate or project your own feelings onto it. Next slide. So interactive fiction. So interactive fiction is where you interact with the fiction, wherein you give text commands to instruct the character. As I've already told you, you choose your character, you choose the plot, you choose the story, you choose the scene, you choose the command to instruct. You have different set of commands that you can choose from, and it's actually it comes after post-colonial studies actually, interactive fiction. And many readers and many modifications, different media readers can make different modifications onto that interactive fiction. So the story replies to you, you give it some command, and the story does what you do, what you say, and you do what it says. So there are descriptive details. And for example, you have chosen a jar. So which jar? It asks you which jar: blue jar, red jar, green jar. You say blue jar, for example. Then it will ask you, is it a small blue jar, a big blue jar, a medium blue jar? So you select it as a big blue jar. So everything, you're actually interacting with the fiction. So there are hundreds of alternatives for you to choose from. So there is the story is dynamic, and the story is not static, and the story changes according to what you choose.
In print, we know, no, the climax, we can imagine the climax. But in e-literature, it completely changes and it depends on our alternative and what we choose from and the option that we select. So we cannot expect or we cannot imagine the climax. Next slide. So these are the text commands that you can give to the computer, to the story, to the e-literature, to the interactive fiction, so that it does what you do. It does what you tell it to do. Yes, next slide. So Emily Short has written a downloadable PDF tutorial, a beginner's guide to playing interactive fiction. You can download it. It's available. It's free. And the interactive materials written by Dennis Zers. So these two things, they'll help you, actually of understanding what interactive fiction is and how you can go about playing it. Yes, next. It's actually like a game. There are a lot of puzzles in it. So the story begins. So the interpreter software introduces about the game, introduces about the characters, idea about the story, what you need to do, what is your character, and the prompt will ask you what you want. Then you reply, you press enter key, and then you enter into the story. So this is the process. Yes, next slide. So, and you are given certain puzzles. So it's like a detective game where you analyze, because an analysis is very important for readers, analyzing a poetry. So you analyze using the puzzles. The clues are given in the previous, maybe the clues are given in the previous one or in the same picture that being showed, the same animation or in the previous animation, the same line or in the previous line, in the same page or in the previous page, the same hypertext or in the previous hypertext. So there are a lot of clues. So the clues might be in the object also. So the clues, certain puzzles are easy, certain puzzles are difficult. And if you're engrossed in the story and if you're truly understanding the story, then only you can actually solve the puzzle and move on to complete it. So interactive fiction is basically, it is not easy doing it. And once you move forward, if you're moving forward, it means that you're completely understanding the story, you're completely understanding the plot, you completely have understood the character. So that aspect is very, very important, and your observation skills are also tested here. Next. So movement, to move from where you are now to another location, all you need to do is type the direction. So you can choose your direction. When we were kids, we had something called a logo, where you can choose the direction. So similar to that, you can choose the direction. You can type in or enter. You can enter into it, or you can come out of it. You have different commands, back, front, different other commands where you can navigate. There are directions, etc. You can come out, you can exit, or you can come in again. And when you exit, you can continue from where you stopped, or you can start it from beginning. And when you start it from beginning, as I already told you, it's not boring, because now you have a completely different character, completely different story, completely different plot, and completely different alternatives. So that's the advantage of it. So basically, the computer uses verb noun, verb preposition noun, preposition noun, person verb noun, and the user gives. For example, if watch is broken, we need to. For example, if the user says, the watch, for example, the watch of the character is broken, it's the user shouldn't give one word answers. He can detailedly explain to the computer that the watch is broken, and the computer can comprehend it using grammar, NLP grammars. It can context-free grammars. Using context-free grammars, the computers comprehend it easily, and they make it part of the story. So whatever you are interacting, whatever commands you're giving, whatever details you're giving, they're incorporated in the story. So you're actually not only reading or not only consuming the literature, but also you are helping in developing the plot. You're also giving instructions. You're also writing a novel, actually. You're indirectly writing a novel, a new novel. So you're both consuming, reading, listening, and writing. So LSRW, all the four skills are used here. Next. So the character moves from one direction to other direction through through either compass or through hypertext. So hypertext fiction is basically a fiction which comprises of hypertext. You have that links from one link to other. You can jump from one link to other. So that is hypertext. And the character moves from one direction to the other direction through compass or through text commands, and also hypertext also. And next one is your next slide. These are the few examples of hypertext fiction. You can easily Google them. You'll understand. Hypertext fiction is basically, when you write a blog, you have a blog fiction, you can write a blog, you can give hypertext, you can, give links in the blog, so that they can navigate from one place to another. Every sentence, every other sentence, you can give a hypertext, you can give a link where they can navigate, they can come back, or they can go to a completely different story. So nowadays, that is what the bloggers are doing. So they have created something called blog fiction. So to create interest and enthusiasm, and get rid of, or be out of this monologue, make it more dynamic. So that's what they're doing. Even in the locative fiction aspect also, writing literature on a different, for example, the computer describes the location and we need to guess the location, where the location is. So that is locative fiction. So when the GPS technology was developed, locative fiction was also started to be used. Yes, and the final aspect is, this is locative fiction. We'll move on. You can go through the slides, and if you have any questions, you can always contact me. You can always interact. You can always email me. Okay. So this is blog fiction, and as I've told you, the bloggers wanted to make their writings more interactive, using different aspects, especially hypertext. They've created their own blog fiction. And the last aspect is 3D fiction, where, this in 3D fiction, I already gave you an example of temple run, cave animation in the temple run, that is 3D fiction. So 3D aspect of it, when you have the 3D aspect of it, it is more interesting, and as if, you are part of the game. It's as if you are running, you are included. So you have certain 3D glass, or no, or you wear a device wherein it's as if, you are part of the game, you are playing it, you are the character. If you move your hand, the hand of the character moves. If you're moving your head, the head of the character moves. If you're running, the character runs. So it's 3D is completely means, it means that you are in the character's place completely, and you are actually playing the role of the character, even though you're not in the virtual world. You imagine as if you're in the virtual world based on the equipment that you're wearing. The equipment makes you part of the game, or part of the novel, especially interactive novel. So you also wear 3D glasses, while consuming. So basically, e-literature is something, it's just not one. It's not like a linear communication. It is an interactive communication. It's a transactional communication where you give inputs, the computer talks to you, you talk to the computer, you are consuming the content on the, also you're also creating the content here. So these are the basic advantages of e-literature, and you can go through the links that I've given you. You can go through the different aspects I've given you. You please take the slide from either Vignesh or Ashita ma'am or someone, and you can, go through the links. If you have any questions, if you have any doubts, or if you want to do something on e-literature, if you want to create a literary piece in e-literature, you can do that. And I'm ready to always give suggestions. And here in Andhra University, we're actually working on a textbook on e-literature, and we're creating a platform for e-literature. Especially, we are planning to create database poetry. So database poetry is what we are interested in currently. Generative database poetry is nothing but generative poetry. And apart from generative poetry, we're also working on creating interactive fiction, that is through block fiction, because block fiction creation is easy and it doesn't require coding. Thank you so much.